Hello, my name is Andy Moore and I'm the Distinctions Manager. And I'm really pleased. I'm joined today with Hazel Frost. Hello, Hazel. How are you?
Hi, Andy. I'm fine, thank you.
Good. Hazel is chair of the travel panel, but is also a moderator for the Licentiate, but also a Licentiate assessor. And this is the first of four videos that we're going to do and talk about the criteria. So the first one I'd like to talk about is the technical and camera work. So Hazel, if I share my screen on the new Licentiate pages, we've updated the criteria. So if I share that with everybody, so if anybody gets a chance to go to www.rps.org and then goes to the licentiate pages, you'll see the criteria. And obviously we've labeled it A, B, and C. So the first point of this video is to talk about section A, if we can, technical and camera work. As we can see, there's 6 bullet points there. So I think if we could just have a chat about those, Hazel, and where you sort of see what we're looking for with those bullet points against the licentiate. So the first one is, they all must show appropriate. So the first one is point of focus and depth of field.
Yeah, as you said, Andy, we are assessing to criteria, and technical ability camera work is one of those. And within that, the point of focus and the depth of field are important in trying to get your message across. So these are things that you apply at the taking stage of the image, and this is the camera work that will affect the overall quality and clarity of any image that you produce. A small, for example, a small aperture gives you a wide depth of field, and that can tell us something about an image. It gives us lots of information. We've got sharp focus all the way through. Likewise, a larger depth of field can give you a larger aperture can give you a narrow depth of field, so it can focus you in onto the important subject. And so by controlling that point of focus and also then the depth of field, you can create the kind of image that you're wanting us to read. And it's a way that certain elements could be perhaps highlighted or focused upon by using, for example, this larger or narrower depth of field.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the key elements if you're going to be a licentiate, handling that background you can do by obviously using obviously the correct depth of field as such, and you can ask the sort of assessor what they want to see in focus and what obviously is out of focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, if someone is showing us a person or an animal, we're looking for critical focus on perhaps the eyes, because that's where you want the viewers to be directed to what should be sharp. However, you may want to blur things in the background to give an effect. So choosing that focal point and that degree of focus at the start when you're setting your camera to take the image will affect the overall type of image, quality of image, the communication of that image with the end result.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you. Choice of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, which kind of builds on the depth of field as well, doesn't it, really?
Absolutely. I mean, these are the sort of the exposure triangle, and they all relate to each other, and different situations require control of different parts of this as to how you're going to balance your image and how you're going to control the light, how you're going to control your shadows and your highlights, how you're going to control noise. So ISO, the higher the ISO, the lower the shutter speed, the lower the apertures you can use, and the higher the apertures you can use, sorry, and the higher the shutter speed you can use. So in evening photography and nighttime photography, you may need to increase the ISO, but increasing the ISO can be associated with an increasing noise. So each of them have their benefits, but has a reduction in other qualities. Likewise, with the shutter speed, this needs to be done accurately, but can also be done creatively. So if you're choosing a slow shutter speed, you may need to use a tripod, but it will also allow you to render things, give you the impression of movement. So you'll be able to show that water is moving by blurring the motion. You can get that sense of movement of someone perhaps running along the street. And equally well, you can use a very fast shutter speed to freeze motion. So you might want to capture a decisive moment. You might want to capture a ball in the air, for example. You might want to capture someone moving very quickly. You might want to communicate droplets of water rather than the sort of milky impression you get with a slow shutter speed. So you choose your shutter speed depending on your available light and depending on your depth of field, which is related to your aperture, which is giving you a focus, and then how much of your subject you want in focus. But it's also going to give you some creativity in terms of whether you want to show movement. You also have to bear in mind all three going together as to whether the image is overexposed or underexposed. And there are circumstances that you may be limited in those in how you control those effectively, because at the end of the day, if you haven't got a tripod, you want to avoid camera shake, so you might have to have a certain shutter speed. So it's all really knowing what message you're trying to get across with your image, what your intent is, and therefore thinking through your camera controls as to how you're going to convey that intent appropriately. And often it means taking an image not on the auto function of the camera. It's thinking a little bit more widely about how you manipulate those controls to add to the clarity of your image.
No, that sounds perfect. I think it's quite rightly said. I think once you know the relationship between the choice of the ISO, the shutter speed and aperture, that's when you could start to be much more creative with your images.
Absolutely. And within creativity, you obviously can use the light, and you can control expressions, emotion, decisive moment. They all hang really on the technical ability being set up at the outset, how you control your camera and where you put your settings. So where your technique is intending to start.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And an interesting one, we get quite a few questions about this: sharpness in relation to the subject matter.
Yeah, I think a phrase that we would use is appropriately sharp. So we're not expecting an image to be pin sharp all the way through, unless that's what the photographer's intending. Equally well, some creative images have very little sharp. So it's an appropriate sharpness in relation to the subject matter. As I mentioned before, often if there's a figure, if there's a person, if it's a realistic type image, you're going to want the focus on the eyes in particular. Be it a human being or be it an animal. You're also going to want focus going back into the background in, for example, a landscape, if you're wanting to give more information in that detail, in that picture. So it's a matter of having the most appropriate focus and the most appropriate focal point for the image that you're trying to get. Some very blurred images, some intentional camera movements, some multiple exposure images often have very little sharp, but it's where that sharpness is placed and whether that's in the right place. It's an intentional choice where you place that sharpness.
Yeah, and again, I think it's another skill we look for someone who wants to become a licentiate, is knowing where that appropriate level is, of not just moving the slider. If they're using a slider right up to 100, it's actually moving it up in increments to a level that it creates it being appropriate, rather than being over sharpened and then maybe getting some digital defects, halos, for example, around certain areas of an image. So it's getting that balance, isn't it?
It is, and that overlaps obviously with one of the other parts of the criteria in technical, the manipulation and the post-production, which we're going to cover in a minute. But yes, I mean, it's a certain amount of sharpening of an image, or effective sharpening of an image, happens in the post-processing stage. But it's easier to do that if you've taken your original image appropriately sharp in the first place. It's very difficult to post-process an image and try and make it sharp when it wasn't in the first place. So choosing that shutter speed, that aperture, the ISO to get that impression of sharpness, or that impression of movement at the camera taking stage, will make it much easier and much more successful in the post-production stage.
Yeah, absolutely. If you get it appropriately, or if you get it sharp at the taking stage, then it's just a small tweak that might be needed to bring it up, but it's not a huge leap of sharpness that's needed that actually then can start destroying the image. But like you said, we'll go on to that about post-production. So next one is level of exposure with control over highlight, shadow detail, and tonal range.
Yes, again, these are things that are dependent on your available light and what you're trying to tell us. So there can be some very deep shadows, some very bright highlights in an image that can be used very creatively and very effectively. And particularly at some of the higher levels, a lot of creativity is using dark shadows and bright highlights. But at Licentiate, we're wanting to know that you can understand light. And so for the greater part, we're wanting to know that you can choose your appropriate settings to control your highlights or your shadow detail. It depends on the available light. It depends on whether it's natural light or whether it's artificial light. If it's artificial light, you've got full control over where your highlights and your shadows are going to be. But it's important that you expose correctly to try and give you as much detail in your histogram, as much of your highlights, as much as your shadow detail as possible in the original taking stage. And then there could be some latitude in underexposing and overexposing, but that can be used more creatively to try and add mood and further information from your image, further communication. But trying to control those details at the taking stage will give you that that ability, later ability to correct things or change things as you wish, to add more creativity to an image. I think we appreciate that something like a chrome on a vehicle, for example, or a setting sun, there's always going to be some very, very bright areas, a candle flame, for example. You're never going to get detail in those highlights. And we understand that, we appreciate that. And in these instances, we allow a certain amount of highlights to be blown or to have down to paper white, these kind of words that you hear about no detail in the highlights. But if that was to cover too big a part of the image or appear to have been done inaccurately or not be appropriate, then that would cause an image to be unsuccessful. So again, it's looking at where highlights might be, looking where shadows might be, and choosing your exposure in the outset.
Yeah, no, perfect. And the other one, a bit like sharpness of this one as well, isn't it? You know, color rendition, if applicable, having that skill to make sure that the color is kind of correct for the image, appropriate.
Appropriate, yes. I mean, obviously at Licentiate, the applicant can choose whether to do a panel of color images or a panel of monochrome or a panel of a combination. And we do see each of those types of panel which are successful. And it's important to play to what your skill is. So if you photograph in colour and you enjoy colour work, then don't feel you have to use monochrome. And likewise, if you are a monochrome worker and you take good monochromes, then you can be very successful at Licentiate with some strong monochromes. Colour, though, has to be again, used appropriately. And so if colours are reflecting perhaps the natural world or reflecting, for example, something in natural history, we're looking for natural colours for the most part. We're looking for the avoidance of colour casts and abnormal colours. We're avoiding for things that are perhaps too saturated or too vibrant, unless you're wanting to use that creatively. And some photographers choose to produce some very, very bright, graphic, colourful panels, and they've chosen to increase the saturation deliberately. But all those choices have to be a deliberate one, not one that you have made in error, so to speak. And the biggest thing to avoid is a cast, a colour cast, that something's appearing a bit more blue or a bit more pink, a bit more magenta than you would hope for. And with monochrome, what we're looking for there is that there is a consistent tonality across your images, that you have that full black, full white tonality across your images, and that those images are consistent with each other. So sometimes it's not just a matter of converting in the post-production sense to monochrome. It's a matter of considering how you're going to use colour and monochrome to convey your image, what message you're trying to tell us, what you're wanting us to read from your image.
Yeah, no, perfect. That makes perfect sense. And the last one, which I think is one of the main reasons I think people actually are not successful, is about post-production. Use of manipulation or post-production techniques, if applicable.
I think you're right, Andy, that this is something that a lot of applicants will fall down on, sadly. They're able to see a good image, they're able to take a good image, and then they choose to alter it in a way that makes it unsuccessful. I think most digital images these days require some amount of post-production sharpening with some form of process in order to do that. But we touched on sharpness before, and sharpening, if done inaccurately, can lead to halos. Masking is also something that can lead to halos. So these are all things that are put in place by the applicant or the photographer after they've taken the image, and they're working on that image to try and make it more acceptable. But if we can see that work, or if it's done inaccurately, then it will lead to an image being unsuccessful. So if we can see a halo around where you've perhaps masked something inaccurately to perhaps put the background out of focus, unless it's done well, we'll pick that up as a digital defect. We're also picking up sensor spots, dust spots, sensor spots. Often in a sky, you can see them. If they're prominent and they can be seen on the screen, then that would cause an image to be unsuccessful. It's also important to consider the resolution, because the digital process that renders your image onto the screen can sometimes be associated with digital banding. And again, that would lead to a panel being unsuccessful if we're seeing the breakup of colour, the breakup of noise in your image when it's inappropriate. And I think the other thing that people will often have problems with is if they are trying to remove part of the image or add to part of the image. And so we're seeing digital work in the form of cloning or healing or repeating patterns that are clearly being done probably to cover something up, but are done for all sorts of different reasons. But if we can see that work, then it's unlikely to be successful.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thanks, Hazel. So I think the three things that we're taking away from this really is, really get to know your camera settings. So taking it off the auto function, getting to understand the manual side of it, the point of focus, the choice of shutter speed, aperture, ISO, all those, how the relation. Secondly, try to take the image in sort of the first shot in cameras as such, try to get the best image you can. And if you are going to use post-production or manipulation, be very careful how you use it and how you apply it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is all, if this is all on the website, and if you have a one-to-one or go to an advisory day, these things will be stressed.
Yeah.
But there's very good information on the website for the L about what each of these terms mean and how you would look for the problems and how you would use these camera settings to give you an effective image.
Yeah. And we'll put the download to the guidelines and the criteria document on this video, so you can download it and have a look. So, okay, that just leaves me to say thank you very much, Hazel. We'll go on to video 2, which is the artistic and visual awareness, and we'll do that in the next video. So thank you very much, Hazel.